Let's begin with the secular studies. I covered this in the past 2 weeks. And now I want to address the issue of practically applying it. After discussing the general approach, which we discussed the Rebbe's battle against Tachlis, meaning the attitude in America and other places that you have to get a secular education in order to be successful. And we also studied the Tanya inside chapter 8. I want to take this now to the next, bring it down to practical advice. What does this mean practically? What is the attitude towards a trade? Is getting a trade similar to going to a college education? What about a job, if you need to get some training to do your job? Questions like this is what I'd like to now address and bring it down practically to each one of us. I'm just looking at all my notes here, make sure I have everything. Yeah. So there are many, many questions. I'll try to read some of them. And ultimately, should I go to college or not, is a question that many have asked. So let me go back to the discussion that I began with the Tanya and apply that. Clearly, let's start with halachically. We know halachically, obviously, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews that have jobs. And they're not doing something hepach halacha, because in Hilchos Talmud Torah, the Alter Rebbe and general Hilchos Talmud Torah talks about the guidelines. Like he says in Tanya, that if you're working and you apply yourself to your work, and you study something in order to help you work, in order lavidas Hashem, l'sparnas berevach, in order to make parnasa, even berevach, but it's lavidas Hashem, you know that the purpose, it's only a means to an end, then obviously it's acceptable. Even though there's like a Gemara in Kedushin that talks about, he said, that maniach es kol umnes, I put away all the jobs and I taught my child only Torah. There's the whole discussion. How is that consistent with the fact that you should not get parnasa from Torah? You have to get parnasa from a job. So there he talks about that. But the bottom line is, this is obviously permissible. The question here is not whether it's permissible. The question is what is optimal, which we'll discuss in a moment. Permissible. And there are many conditions of how that's permissible. That Tzemach Tzedek in Derech Mitzvah on Levushi Kahanim talks about this a little differently. He adds, based on the Tanya, that even in Parnasa, a person shouldn't put his head too much into it, more than necessary. Only to know that this is, like he says in Tanya, Kardem Lachter Bei. This is an axe, this is a tool, an instrument for which to use. They say, Rabbi Levik says, just like a kardem, when you're cutting down, let's say, a tree, or you're using an instrument to achieve something, you have no interest in the instrument. You only have the interest in the result of it. So there's no koch and there's no involvement, immersion in the instrument itself. It's only a means. So as such, that of course is acceptable. But the Rebbe, as I said before, wanted to change the world. Didn't want just to fit into the structure of the world and do it as halachically as possible. Lefnim Meshura Sadin. Chassidus is lefnim, going beyond the letter of law. You want to bring Seviv Kalaman into the picture. You want to bring Eina Motzei into the picture. There's a higher expectation. And that's where you quote the Tanya. Why is the Tanya talking the Chatchila? Just say that. Why is it starting to say Chochmas Chitzenius? You're allowed to learn them if you do it l'shem shamayim, like he says, Kardem Lachter Bei, or then further those that do it for the purposes of to add in Yediyas, in knowing how to serve Hashem, which can be through, let's say, contemplating on nature and appreciating God's greatness, or l'teirose, learning Hilchos Kiddush HaChedesh. Why doesn't he begin lechatchila? Because the Alter Rebbe is setting a standard. What is your mind supposed to be focusing on? The mind of a Jew should be focusing on what God wants of you, the purpose of your existence. That's Kedusha. Anything else is metames hameach. That's why the Alter Rebbe sets the standard. The Rebbe just continues where that goes on. Is it permissible? Of course it's permissible, because you need instruments. We live in a world where you need instruments. In the letter that I cited last week from Chelik Tes, from Tovshin Tes, Chelik Gimel Nigis Kedesh, so I cited there that that he brings the different levels, 6 different ways that you can learn. One of the things he says is that in order to fulfill Torah, you need to know some math. You may need other things in order to appreciate, like he went to study 18 months by the shepherd in order to figure out the mumim. So it's a hechsher mitzvah. But that's all it is. The focus is on what? Your moyach is focused on Kedusha. So the Rebbe's standard is that. To the Chatchila go and say initially, I'm going to go and get a secular education, and then I'm going to figure out, that's not for most people. Your job is to fulfill the mission for which you were sent. So there's a sikha, fascinating sikha, many sikhas, which I'm going to refer to in a moment, where he talks in, this is Yud Beis Tammuz, Tov Shin Chav Zayin. The Rebbe explains the Tanya. He says the following. In explaining the Tanya, he says, that what does it mean to be metames amech? He says Tumah does not change anything physically. You don't see any difference between something that's toid or tomei. With your eye, you can't see a difference. And nevertheless, you say by Torah, you say Torah is metayer the mayach, and chochmas kutzenis is not. The Rebbe asked the question: the same type of mind that you're using by Tana and Ameda and learning the laws of Kiddush HaChedesh, let's say, the laws of sanctifying the new moon, astronomical laws, or the laws of Erevin, which is very mathematical, calculating space and so on and so forth, geometry. What is the difference if someone is studying mathematics? The same ideas, the same way, how you add, how you subtract, how you calculate, how you understand the positions of things, angles, etc., etc. What's the difference? So the Rebbe says the difference is like Torah and Tomei. What is the difference? Because nature, science, its approach is there's nature. The nature of the world exists, and it has its rules, and we cannot change them. And if there is ability to change them, it's also part of the laws of nature. So B'meila, there's no change. Like I said before, the status quo. We're only going to figure out to understand what causes nature to be this way. Which means essentially you're not bringing in any other dimension except what a material existence has. You're understanding the world. The idea why God created the world, or what God wants of the world. The Einemotze, as I said, that's not existent in science. And it's not meant to be. That's why science can only talk about realizing that which exists. When it comes to Torah, and Torah learns Hilchos Kiddush HaChedesh, you're not just learning an astronomical calculation of when the moon is in what phase and what stage it becomes a new moon or so on, or the other mathematical things. The whole point is to understand how to fulfill God's will in this world, to sanctify the moon, or to use that knowledge to some way transform this world. And that's the difference between Torah and Tameh. Think about it. So Tameh simply means because you're just becoming part of the world, and that's what it is. The Rebbe uses actually the same thing, why it says Das Balabatim is Hepech Das Torah. Why? A balabas who learned Torah, why is Hepech Das Tatim, which means when it comes to Nyoni Halacha, Das Balabatim, which is a Balabatish Hanocha, is Hepech Das Torah. Because a balabas thinks from Das Tachten. He's thinking about the world as it is. And Das Torah is supposed to be Das Elyon, how God wants the world to be. And that's a very different perspective. This doesn't mean the balabas necessarily is thinking Hepech HaTorah, but it means it's Hepech changing the world. That part of it. So the whole idea of secular education, if you really think about it, is about, are we here to change the world, or are we here to just fortify it? Even if it can be used in a good way. And the key here is to understand that. The idea of transforming the universe. Now, this leads to another concept. Why it says in Chassidus that Chochmas HaUmas lead a person to be a yesh, and Chochmas HaTorah lead a person to have bittul. Because that's what it is. If you study the world, I always wondered, so what, someone studies mathematics, they become a yesh? It's not whether they become arrogant, it's they are solidifying and it's reinforcing existence. That's what it's all about. And therefore, inevitably, it makes existence a more powerful entity. As a matter of fact, now you understand it as well. You can manipulate it. Whereas Torah comes to introduce bittul, that the world is not tefes makom, that it's not that powerful, that this world can be changed and should be changed. The classic story with the chassid, you can say here, the chassid and the philosopher, and they were discussing whether God exists. The debates. And finally, the chassid exasperated says to the non-chassid, says to the philosopher, he says to him, I envy you. You think about God all the time. I think about myself all the time. He goes away thinking he's flattered. In truth, later he discovers, or someone tells him that he's actually an insult. You think about God all the time because you know you exist. The only question is whether God exists. So you wonder. Das Tachten. I think about myself all the time because I know God exists. The question is whether I exist. Am I an illusion? Do I exist? Why do I exist? What's the purpose, etc., etc. This is not just semantics. It's a very different perspective. So this is far deeper than just, can I go and study secular studies or not? It comes down to, are you focusing on the purpose of your existence? And if you are, the instruments that you may need, yes. And that's why the Rebbe stood him so much, especially for children of a young age. A Shliach told me the other day that if he studied secular studies at a young age, he doesn't know if he'd be a Shliach today. Because he would have, his standards and his values would have been shaped by that. He really had almost no choice. So you could say that's a negative thing. Well, in a pure mind, when you're a young person, if you're focused on the right thing, like the Rebbe told Herbert Wiener in 9.5 Mystics, he writes. He tells the Rebbe that he looks in the Bochrim's eyes and he sees that they are naive. The Rebbe says it's not. There's no dichotomy. They don't have two worlds. So it's true in this world to have a duality, to have two worlds becomes very difficult. The whole point of Chassidus, the whole point of the Rebbe is that there should be no duality. So that's the standard on the highest possible level. Very interesting. I want to read something also in Derech Mitzvah Mitzvah's Milah, and it's also in Eira Teire Bamidbar. Let's see inside page 1469 in Bamidbar and Deisofis. He talks about the difference between Aristotle and the Rambam. I'll just read to you a few lines. He says, what is the difference between the philosophers like Rambam and Aristotle? They were both philosophers. The Rambam, the more he understood the truth of God, the more in awe, the more the more diminished he became, the more bittul he had. And that is, the more he understood, the more he became greater in his own eyes, because now I understand in my mind God. But the Isha Leki, the Rambam Adarab Mitzad Hasogazu Yagil Habitla Amiti, Lahafshlich Nafshe Meneged Kol V'Kol, that ready to give his life away for God. And he brings the Ramah in Darkei Moshe Erechaim Siman Aleph, who writes as such. It's a very interesting piece. This is Derech Mitzvah Mitzvah's Milah, and as I said in the Midbar in the Sofas Eira Teire, the concept of bittul. And that's what the Rambam says. That's what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, like Kagoyin HaRambam and Ramban. The Rambam, in the Madura Kama, I believe it only said the Rambam, because the Rambam, even before he did it for Parnasa, remember, he first was his brother, before he tragically was killed, he was Mefarnes, he supported the family. It was only after he was killed that Rambam went to study medicine, become a doctor. But before that, his knowledge of secular stuff was because he knew he was only focused on one thing, knowing God better, serving God better, understanding Torah better. Like he says in Hilchos Talmud Torah, you learn Derech Eretz, Yerushalayim, and so on. So now to bring it down to practical, well, that's the highest standard. That's what the Rebbe wanted of us. That's the highest standard. Now, of course, not everybody necessarily can live up to the highest standard. Like he says in that Gemara in Kedushin I mentioned, that I put all the umnus away to teach my son Torah because Torah lasts forever, whereas a regular job brings you money when you're hungry, and then what happens at the end, it's temporary, as he puts it there. Yet there's also the thing to teach someone umnus. There's a famous hadran the Rebbe made, Chafov Tavshin Yud, where he discusses this. And so Al Pi Halach also, the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Talmud Torah speaks about that you're not supposed to use Torah for Parnasa. But if, once you already studied Torah Lishma, and then you can make use of it also for Parnasa, he gives there the Haterim how you can do it. But there were people who Vadavke wanted to get a job, a trade, and a trade requires study. So obviously, not only is it acceptable, you find that this was a derech. Is it the standard the Rebbe wanted? He wanted a community to be trade, but it was acceptable because there are ways that you can do it. But don't worship it and suddenly worship the Welt. That's not the point. Maybe a person who's Hashgacha Pratis went into a trade or in any other way, any other way, was involved in material world, could also see Hashgacha Pratis elevated. But as I said before, the goal here is changing the world. This explains why the Rebbe would encourage people who already started college, or professors, etc., to finish, because he saw that that's your Hashgacha Pratis, and that's your job to go there and show the power of Yiddishkeit, demonstrate through the tools and the credibility that you have, because it is mutter when you do it that way, like he says in Tanya. But initially, this is the shlichus. Why didn't the Rebbe just choose a whole bunch of mitzuyonim in yeshiva and say, listen, you guys go and become physicists, mathematicians, lawyers, and doctors? Because l'chatchila, the best way to change the world is to be above the world and get the minimal you need for that type of, for achieving your mission. Those that are already there, that's their shlichus. And then, of course, people, whatever reason, Hashgacha Pratis, did not go on a shlichus directly, or are not in that situation. Obviously, a trade, which is a legitimate Torah trade, as much as you need, that is all focused on helping an instrument and helping you get the parnasa, is absolutely acceptable. And done properly, you actually can make a Kiddush Hashem, and you can fulfill your shlichus that way too. You have the Binyamin Kletzkers, and you have the others that were involved in different type of businesses, who are great chassidim, and through their business, they use their business for Eined Molvade, as the famous story goes when he made his calculations. So bottom line, it encompasses everyone, but still, if you want us to talk of the highest standard was established. Now what about, people say today, listen, I want to have a good job, and I want to go to college and get that education. Many people are doing that. The criteria is very simple. Why are you going? If it's completely focused on parnasa, and you don't immerse yourself more than necessary in distractions, and your whole purpose of it is to come change the world in some way, then there's some acceptability there. Now the Rebbe was obviously encouraged people not to go to college for the environment, and above all because usually they don't maintain their focus. But after the fact that someone's done it, as I said, the chatchila, I would say that if you ask the Rebbe would discourage, I would say, most people. There are exceptions. I'm not here to criticize anyone. I'm here just simply to state, without compromising what the Rebbe said, without compromising integrity. Each person has to go to their mashpia and see their own personal condition. I'm not here to give a blanket statement, but if you look in the sichas, it's very, very clear what the Rebbe's standards are. And I'm going to actually now read a list of a whole bunch of sichas that can help us all look inside yourself. I'll begin with the famous sichas Simchas Torah Tovshin Tezvov, where the Rebbe spoke very much b'yisrakshus, very emotional. And he kept on saying, he talked very strongly about not being metama and focusing. And it's very clear, he was going to war not against education, God forbid, not against knowing math, knowing how to sign your name, against worshiping it, in place of changing the world, becoming part of the world, and succumbing and surrendering. So you could look that sikh up. He speaks also about the age to try to minimize the exposure to age 9. He says age 5 there, age 9, well, they're different ages. But the younger, obviously, because that's when they're impressionable years. Miketz Tovshin Chavov, Achrei Tovshin Lamed Ches. Both those sikhs, interesting. I believe there were talks given with the Pekisha when the college students were here in New York by the Fabrengen. The Rebbe speaks that in general, what I mentioned earlier, secular education does can be metame, and it brings a certain element of reinforcing existence, and also focuses on the multiplicity and duality of existence, the distinctions. But the Rebbe says, interestingly, as the years have rolled on and we're getting closer to Mashiach, also secular knowledge, science, is coming closer from duality to unity. Yud Shvat Tov Shel Lamed Zayin, that's printed in Likutei Sichos Chelik Tazayin, volume 16, page 145. Ekev Tovshin Memches is a Meredike Sicha. And a footnote there, the Rebbe speaks about how everything originates in Torah. And actually there's a very interesting edit that the Rebbe made there when he edited that Sicha. It's in Sefer Sichos Tovshin Memches, where the Rebbe talks about that in Torah, just like science gets to the root of understanding every physical phenomenon, Torah gets to the root of understanding the root of the physical phenomenon and the spiritual phenomenon. And therefore it's all rooted in Torah. And the Rebbe's edited there, it said there that in Torah, Gam Shorshe Haruchni, you also get to know the root of the spiritual. And the Rebbe took out the word Gam and just wrote, you only know the spiritual root. And not only, it doesn't say only, but it takes out Gam. Which means, because sometimes Torah, you don't, for example, in Torah, can you open up a Torah and do heart surgery? Not necessarily. Even if someone can, most people can't. Which leads me to a very interesting concept. It seems, from some of the tzichas and talks from the Rebbe on this matter, that there would be a very, very ambitious and very admirable venture if somebody could actually teach our children mathematics and some of the other sciences that are necessary for life in this material world, through the Torah. Since there's Erevin and there's Kiddush HaChedesh and astronomy, and someone who knows what's out there today in science, modern science, that actually studying it that way, and therefore showing immediately that all this knowledge is an instrument. So the idea of understanding that it's an instrument is critical. However, obviously the younger children, if you try to, they will not necessarily make the distinction, and they may grab and they think the instrument is more important than the purpose for which it is, which is the reason of the minimizing of that exposure. And then a few other sikhs I just want to throw out there. Bolok, Chukas Bolok, Tovshin Tezvov, Purim and Yud Gimel Tammuz Tovshin Tezayin, Yud Beis Tammuz Tovshin Yud Zayin, Simchas Torah Tovshin Chof, Chof Ov and Ekev Tovshin Chof Aleph, Purim Tovshin Chof Beis, Simchas Beis Sheva and Purim Tovshin Chof Gimel, Tovshin Chof Tes as well, Shlach Tovshin Chof Tes, Simchas Torah Tovshin Lamed, Yud Aleph Nisan Tovshin Lamed Beis, Purim Tovshin Lamed Hey, Yud Beis Tammuz Tovshin Lamed Zayin, Chayei Sora Tovshin Lamed Tes, and Yud Beis Tammuz Tovshin Mem Zayin. If I said it quickly, you can always go back and listen to it again here. But these are sources that I think you can all look up and find tremendous insights in all these ideas. I would also mention Yutas Kislev and Vayeshev Tovshin Chav Ches, which is very similar to some of the ideas discussed in the Yud Beis Tammuz Chav Zayin that I mentioned earlier as well. Okay.